Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. We are back in the room where all of the lighting is blue. I swear to God, it is sunny and bright outside, but this room is just impossible to film in. But this is my Sir's dungeon, so this is kind of where I have to film if I'm here and I want to film on the weekend, so we're just going to have to deal with it. Sorry if it bothers you, it bothers me too. But the topic of today's video is not going to be about the status of the lighting in this room. It is going to be about asexuality and BDSM. If you guys don't know, I am asexual. I am grey-ace specifically. That means that I experience sexual attraction very infrequently and for limited durations of time. I don't necessarily want to get into in this video what asexuality is, what being grey-a is, all of that stuff, because I think there's a lot of other YouTubers and channels out there that have explored that subject really well, like more so than I ever could in just this one video. So I'm going to link those down below for you guys if you want to read more and watch more and kind of just listen to people's stories about what it's like to be an asexual person in general, what asexuality means, what it doesn't mean. Very briefly, being asexual is not being in chastity. Being asexual is not being celibate. Being asexual doesn't mean that you haven't found the right person. Being asexual doesn't mean that you can't be romantic with somebody. You can also be aromantic, which means that you don't experience any kind of romantic attraction. For the purposes of this video, I am strictly going to be talking about asexuality and not aromanticism, although that is another identity that is very valid and I think is definitely underrepresented on the whole in the world at large and also in the BDSM community. So if you want to learn more about those things in general, what they are, I will be happy to answer comments that I can down below if you guys have any questions about how it relates to me. But I can only really talk about my personal experience as an asexual person. I cannot speak for everybody who is asexual on the whole, because asexuality is a spectrum. Now, that is, again, like I said, a whole other conversation. I want to specifically talk about what it's like to be asexual in BDSM. Now, I, up to this point, have not been very open about the fact that I am asexual. It's not because I've been trying to hide it. It's not because I'm ashamed of it. It's just not something that is super relevant for the most part in my videos. Like, it's not something that I would really feel the need to mention because it's something that's part of my personal life, but it doesn't necessarily affect the way that I talk about, you know, water sports or pet play or something like that. Like, it's not something that I talk about a whole lot because it's not something that gets brought up through just the kind of things that I make on this channel. But I have noticed since I've gotten a Tumblr, since I've gotten kind of more involved in my social media and kind of interacting with people more, there's actually like several people that are asexual in BDSM who feel really alone, feel like they don't know other people who are asexual, who don't understand how their proclivities in BDSM interact with their identity as an asexual person. And I want to talk more about that because I think it's really important that asexual people are visible, that asexual people are represented. They have somebody like me, although I am certainly not anywhere near like being a good spokesperson or a good role model, but somebody who can make content who relates to them, who understands their personal struggle in BDSM based on their asexuality. And I think it's very similar to why it's important to have queer women and lesbians talk about being in BDSM, why it's important to have gay men talk about being in BDSM, why it's important for pansexual people, omnisexual people, kind of any person, any minority group to express their own individual experience in the BDSM, because where your intersections are, be that your race, be that your gender, be that your sexuality, be that your level of romantic attraction, all that is going to affect how you experience BDSM, and it's going to make it different from the way other people experience BDSM. Another reason why I want to talk about all this is I think there's a lot of misconceptions around BDSM that involve sex and that involve asexuality. And that's kind of going to be the bulk of why I'm talking about this. So, if you have been on the internet for any length of time, and you have been on any kind of social media for any length of time, be that FetLife, Instagram, Tumblr, Snapchat, whatever, you will see it be brought up at some point in time that BDSM is sexual. Just complete blanket statement, period, the end, no ifs, ands, or buts. BDSM is sexual. That does not mean that BDSM is sexual for everyone. It can be sexual. I think a better way of describing BDSM is maybe not just BDSM is sexual, but that BDSM can be sexual, and that it does deal with a lot of subversion around sexuality, that it deals with a lot of acting in a way that is against the norms of how people express their sexuality. But expressing their sexuality doesn't necessarily mean having sex and putting genitals together in various combinations. Um, that is not what BDSM is about. I think it's very reductivist to talk about BDSM exclusively as a sexual activity. I think that is something when you're getting started in BDSM, or as a vanilla person understands BDSM. BDSM is purely a sexual act. BDSM is something that people get off doing. BDSM is something that people do because it charges them erotically for some reason. And I think it's easier for people who are newer to the scene, people who are vanilla, to understand BDSM that way, because we're all into weird stuff sexually. Like, to some degree, we generally have at least one thing that is maybe a little bit different, that turns us on, or that, you know, makes us excited sexually. So it's easier for people to understand BDSM, which is like this weird, crazy thing. And like, how could people do that? If it's just like, oh, it's a sex thing. Like, that makes it a lot easier to like dismiss or explain. If it's like, oh, it's because it's like really hot for these people sexually, it makes it easier to understand. So that is why it gets labeled that way, I think. But that doesn't mean that's all that BDSM is. I think it's a lot easier, again, for people to understand it that way, but that doesn't make it the only thing that it is. BDSM is also very sensual. BDSM is also very emotional. It can be very physically cathartic. It can be enjoyable on levels other than the sexual level, and that is the big thing I want to get across this video. If you are asexual and you are gray A, if you are, you know, anything along the asexual spectrum, if you are demi, you can be part of BDSM, and you shouldn't be not allowed to be part of BDSM because you think that it is a sexual thing or people have told you it's a sexual thing. It doesn't have to be. It is perfectly normal, acceptable to enjoy BDSM on levels other than the sexual level. For me personally, I do BDSM not because it gets me off. Like, it's just not a thing that I experience on a sexual level, with very, very rare exceptions. I do it because I have a physical / mental need for this kind of relationships. I am only mentally and emotionally satisfied when I am in a DS relationship. I find having a vanilla relationship to be very unsatisfying. There's something missing about there. I need that power exchange. I need that regulation in my life. But it's not because I need it sexually. It's because that's what makes me feel good as a person. That is what makes me feel good in my life generally, is having that kind of order and structure that a DS dynamic presents to me. And it's not because it is something that I get off to. I'm not trying to tell people who experience BDSM sexually like that what they're doing is wrong, but I'm trying to say that it's completely up to your own personal motivations, and there's nothing wrong with doing BDSM non-sexually. At the same time, if DS isn't what you're about and you're a top or a bottom and you're asexual, that is totally fine. Any kind of play in BDSM, be that rope bondage, be that needles, be that water sports, be that pet play, be that DDLG, be that impact play, none of that has to have a sexual connotation whatsoever. And even if you're a sexual person, even if you're not asexual, you can still do these things non-sexually and find them rewarding for different reasons. Like, for example, I'm not a pain person normally, but I really like needles. And the reasons why I like needles is because for me, they present a very like physical cathartic release, not because I get wet when I have needles put in me, although some people are that way, obviously. But any kind of play that you do doesn't have to have any particular motivation. You could do rope bondage because you find the physics of rope bondage really interesting and you want to figure out how that works. Like, that is totally acceptable and totally fine. Any kind of play, any kind of dynamic you can participate in, and it is totally normal and fine to not experience it sexually. I hear a lot of arguments on the internet about how DLG or pet play or whatever is inherently sexual, which doesn't really make sense to me. The only part that's inherent in pet play, the only thing that you need to have to do pet play or DDLG or another kind of BDSM dynamic, is power exchange. Any level of power exchange boom, that's it. You don't need to have sex. You don't need to be thinking about it sexually. It's not inherently sexual. Boom, end of rant. Now that I have understood all of that, I'm going to talk about more about my personal experience being asexual and being in BDSM. Now, I want to talk about my own personal experience being in BDSM and being asexual as well. As I mentioned earlier, I find vanilla relationships usually relatively unsatisfying. I don't get this level of stuff that I need that I get out of a DS relationship. So up until I was 19 and I was in vanilla relationships, I had a lot of pressure to do sexual acts. I had a lot of pressure around just so much stuff that partners expected me to do, and I wasn't really necessarily as aware at the time that I was asexual. Being in BDSM actually allowed me to explore being an asexual person more, because people generally don't ask a lot of rude and invasive questions. They're generally very accepting of alternative sexualities. They just generally don't care, really. I mean, unless you are going to a sex-centric party, it really shouldn't be a problem if you are asexual and participating in the BDSM community. Also, I should mention, asexuals have different levels of sexual repulsion. Some people are completely sex positive, some people like me are sex neutral, and other people are sex repulsed or sex negative. Doesn't necessarily mean that they think sex is bad or that they think other people doing sex is wrong. It just for them personally, different acts of sex, different, seeing genitalia in general, it's not something they would prefer to see in their lives. And if you're one of those people who is asexual and you are sex repulsed, be careful when you're going to BDSM parties, because while there may not be explicit sexual acts, there will be a lot of nudity, and I know that's going to be a problem for some people on the ace spectrum. So be aware of that if you're going to a party. I've never personally found that to be a problem. If anything, I think, being an asexual person in BDSM and then going to clubs that have exposed me more to other people's sexual expression has been like a really healthy experience for me, and it's helped me a lot with my sexual repulsion. And I'm now more of a sex neutral person. It doesn't really freak me out when I see sexual acts anymore. It doesn't really bother me as much. So that's actually like a positive thing that's come out of being an asexual person in BDSM, is it's helped me to, grow out of a lot of those kind of fears that I had before. And I guess a lot of people who are asexual in BDSM also worry that they won't be able to find play partners because they're asexual. And if BDSM is a sexual thing, why would you want to play with somebody who's not going to have sex with you? And that is pretty much a non-issue. Every time that I've had pick-up play, every single time that I've met somebody at a dungeon and played with later, sex is pretty much not on the table. It's usually people negotiate, and it's like, what body parts can I touch? What things can I say to you? Intercourse is never an assumed thing. Intercourse is never the assumed goal, 90% of the time when you're doing a BDSM activity, unless you're going into it expecting sex. If you meet up with somebody and you really, really want to have a hot fisting scene, yeah, that's going to be sexual. But if you're negotiating for a flogging, you're probably not going to think about, we're going to have a flogging and then afterwards we're going to have penis from vagina intercourse, right? No, people pretty much never assume that. It's not really ever been a problem that I've had. And people pretty much don't notice that I'm asexual, and that's kind of both a blessing and a curse, because if people assume that you are asexuality that you're not, for example, being a bisexual person but having a heterosexual relationship, people are going to assume because you're heterosexual presenting that you are heterosexual. In the same way that if you are asexual and you do not present as asexual, which is basically impossible to do, really, asexuality is very much invisible because it's not as performative as it's the opposite of being performative, right? It's the lack of doing an act. And sometimes people just assume that you don't like to have sex publicly or whatever, so they don't think that you're asexual, and that can cause confusion. But generally it's not an issue. It just is sort of like an, oh, really? I didn't know that about you, kind of thing. It's pretty much never a problem. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about before I end this video, and it's more of a personal thing, being a gray-A person. Like I talked about before, asexuals exist in different states of feelings about sex. They can be sex repulsed, they can be sex negative, they can be sex neutral, they can be sex positive, sex ambivalent, whatever terminology you want to use. Some people who are grey-A, some people who are asexual, even though they don't experience sexual attraction, they can still perform sexual actions. And it doesn't make it wrong, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. When we talk about consent, a lot of times the conversation is around enthusiastic consent, about a very emphatic yes to sex. And you can be asexual and have that, but a lot of times, especially in the context of a DS relationship, you can negotiate to perform certain sexual acts, even though you are asexual, because it is part of your duty as a submissive, part of your duty as a slave to perform these sexual acts for your master, your dom, your whatever. And that is perfectly okay. That's not abuse and it's not coercive. If that is something you honestly want to do, for me personally, I find it a lot easier to not necessarily enjoy, but like just do sexual acts because they're based around a DS relationship, because it's based around my behavior as a submissive to perform these acts as part of a power exchange dynamic to perform these sexual acts. A lot of people have asked me about, if you're asexual, how can you have sex? But it's like, you cannot experience sexual attraction but still have sex with people. Like it's not like, I don't think it's that weird for me personally. Like it's a thing. It happens. You can be asexual. You can have sex as part of your DS dynamic. That is perfectly fine. You can be asexual and never, ever, ever have sex in your DS dynamic, or never, ever at all. And you can be asexual and have sex with one person. You can be having sex with multiple people. It is perfectly, totally fine. Again, it is about sexual attraction, not sexual action. That is kind of where I wanted to leave this video, I guess. It's a topic I'm not necessarily sure how to approach because there's so many layers to it, but if you guys have specific questions about being asexual and BDSM, thoughts, feelings, etc., please feel free to leave that down in the comments below. You can find links to everything I talked about in this video, links to my social media, all of that down in the description below if you want to check that out. I also have a link to my Patreon if you want to support this channel and see more content. Every dollar really does help. But until I see you next time, have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.